But if you just think about these immense amounts of cash sitting in corporates, sitting in foundations, sitting in universities, this is something which, despite the fact that a lot of these institutions, corporations or others, are pretty good at supply chain sustainability. So they can go through their scope 3 of people making clothes or making electronic equipment or whatever, but they haven't traced through. So if we put our cash into these bonds or into this bank, what is it they're doing? What's their scope through? Trace it all the way through. It's not as if they don't have the capabilities. It's just that gets organized by their corporate treasury department, and their corporate treasury department does not usually have the sustainability director knocking on its doors coming down the corridor saying, hey, we want to understand what's going on with our financial supply chain. But this is the thing that's changing.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Climate Tech 360, where we connect with diverse voices in the climate sector to make informed choices in supporting the future of climate technologies. I'm your host, Samia, and we are back with season 2. I took a little break to map out the entirety of the second season, which I am really, really excited to share. This whole process of finding, interviewing, and researching these guests and their work has given me sort of big picture insights on the climate sector and climate tech specifically that I haven't always had the time or opportunity to focus on in my day job. And my hope is that it will do the same for you. In season 2, I'm sticking with the same themes around how to scale and finance the technologies that'll have the greatest impact towards our path to net zero. I'm also going to be switching to releasing episodes on a bi-weekly basis to give myself enough time to curate a pipeline of the highest quality guests. I have been relentless on reaching out to people who are truly thought and execution leaders in this space. And I think each and every one of these episodes will be value added because the guests are phenomenal. So back to today's episode. Today I'm speaking with James Vaccaro, Executive Director of the Climate Safe Lending Network. James is a strategist and systems thinker with over 20 years of senior management experience in sustainable banking and investment. James has been a non-executive director for a broad range of environmental and social businesses. He served on the Global Steering Committee for the UNEP Finance Initiative and was one of the founding developers of the UN Principles for Responsible Banking launched back in 2019. Prior to this discussion and looking into the work that James has done, I had no idea that the emissions generated by many companies, cash and investments is potentially their largest source of emissions and is not included in the scope 1, 2, and 3 calculations. In this episode, we discuss the true impact of corporate cash and investment emissions, what companies can do to manage their financial supply chains, and the role that technology can play in that transition. And now onto the episode. Well, James, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to learn about the work that you're doing right now with Climate Safe Lending Network. But just for context, it would be great if you could tell us what the origin story is of the organization and the work that you're doing there.
So maybe just for context, I mean, I do a portfolio of things. So I was at a positive impact bank called Triodos in Europe for some time, helped set up the UN Principles for Responsible Banking, and then became more interested in the systemic shifts. So Climate Safe Lending Network, the origins are that it's a multi-stakeholder network. So it's sort of saying we want to focus on what banks can do in terms of accelerating the transition, but it's not just about bankers. It absolutely includes them, the leadership and the change makers inside them, but it's also about investors and NGOs and regulators and academia and all the different stakeholders who are in and around banking to be able to make the most difference. So it operates as a sort of knowledge sharing. We do some sort of thought provocations. We do a lot of learning and development for people within banks. We do a lot of convening for different groups. And some of those groups might be sort of constellations which don't usually get brought together, like people working with customer functions. And that was the origin of the Carbon Bankroll, working with Topo Finance, Bank Forward, and others in doing that research.
I think that work is really interesting. It sounds really complicated, though, to get all those stakeholders I mean, for the most part, you can't even get them to agree on a definition. So what happens when you get all those stakeholders in a room?
Yeah, so the first thing to say is you don't just stick them in a room. I mean, you have to do quite creative facilitation to be able to make that convening work. So we've worked with game designers to create simulations of climate and bank policies, and we've had mainstream banks on the same team as radical activists, and being able to collaborate. So we find ways to be able to break through. What you do find when you're able to put people together is that there's sometimes a latent consensus, a sort of thing that's in common that you didn't know, which emerges. So some of the papers which we've done on policy interventions on banking regulations is sort of says, well, okay, here's a bunch of ideas. What do you think would have the most impact on climate? What do you think would be the most feasible to implement? And we've been able to look at the whole community and find, well, where's there actually agreement on things, which otherwise you wouldn't know that you would have agreement, and then sort of suggested, well, those would be good places to start. And that then sets our agenda. So we're very deliberate in terms of how we do bring the group together. And the other side is we're not trying to force a normative consensus. It's not like, well, we've all got to agree on this as being the path. When you do, my experience of that personally is that you end up with something which is so dilute, it feels like it's meaningless. What's better is to have a debate where you've actually had a lot of full airing of not just the superficial stuff, but a lot of the deeper things, and like trying to uncover what are the mental models here? What are those kind of core beliefs which might be less helpful to carry forward into the future? And how can we talk about those and air them in a safe space without needing to make a commitment about them so that the whole community can progress?
Your organization co-authored this excellent report called The Carbon Bankroll, which I'm going to link in the show notes. And you talk about the impact of climate of a company's banking practices. So I'm just going to read out a quote from there. So you say, for Alphabet, Meta, PayPal, the emissions generated by their cash and cash investments or financed emissions exceed all their other emissions combined. That means for a company like Microsoft in 2021, the emissions generated by the company's $130 billion in cash investments were comparable to the cumulative emissions generated by the manufacturing, transporting, and use of every Microsoft product in the world. That is astounding. And having worked in banks or in finance my entire career, I had no idea that that was the case. Do you usually find that most people have no idea about this?
Yeah, absolutely. They had no idea about it. The companies themselves didn't. It took a long time for them to get their heads around this. So I worked back then with Paul Moinster at Topo Finance, and he's in fact Topo Finance have just put out the successor publication. And if anything, in terms of being able to get a little bit smarter with the estimation kind of methodology, the figures it's even more pronounced than we found back then. And the reason is, I mean, if you take companies, so in the first report, you take a company like Apple, you kind of think, well, how can this be the case? And then you realize that it's got almost $200 billion of cash on its balance sheet. This is like, who does that? I mean, that's more than some banks I could mention.
That's more than 4 times the US government reserves.
It's a huge amount of cash. And I think back at the time, it was 13 companies combined on the S&P 500 had $1 trillion. I think that now it's about maybe 20. There's been some pay downs from some of the big Silicon Valley. But if you just think about these immense amounts of cash sitting in corporates, sitting in foundations, sitting in universities, this is something which, despite the fact that a lot of these institutions, corporations or others, are pretty good at supply chain sustainability. So they can go through their scope 3 of people making clothes or making electronic equipment or whatever, but they haven't traced through. So if we put our cash into these bonds or into this bank, what is it they're doing? What's their scope 3? Trace it all the way through. It's not as if they don't have the capabilities. It's just that gets organized by their corporate treasury department. And their corporate treasury department does not usually have the sustainability director knocking on its doors, coming down the corridor saying, hey, we want to understand what's going on with our financial supply chain. But this is the thing that's changing. And in fact, in the last report, I mean, there was somebody in sustainability at Atlassian software company saying when that report came out, they talked about little else for the next kind of couple of weeks. And when I spoke to some of these big companies, which was a first for me, you could tell that they had simply never been asked this question before. This insight was not known to them. And there was this thing which had just emerged, which they were not really aware of, despite it hiding in plain sight. I mean, it wasn't a shock that they had $200 billion. It's just that they never joined the dots before.
So break it down for me like I'm a 12-year-old. Banks make their money off of you as a depositor, deposit cash, and they take that money and they lend it. And that's how they're making money. And we never think about that, right? Because what we think about is like, okay, how do we split our money into different banks so that it's FDIC insured? We obviously, a lot of us went through this with the Silicon Valley Bank incident last year. You try to spread your money across banks. They take that money and they lend it. And it's interesting because especially in Europe, all these neobanks have emerged, which have been really useful, but they don't have that bank lending model. But they're also really struggling to make money. So most of these large institutional banks will take that money and lend it. And what you're saying is they lend it to fossil fuel, oil and gas companies. And that's where the emissions comes from. Is that the simplified version of it?
Yeah. So banks lend money to a range of clients, and all of those clients have got an impact. The largest impact when it comes to clients, obviously, is going to be through fossil fuels. So disproportionately, the loans which are being made to fossil fuel companies are those which are going to add the most. The ones which are in sort of carbon intensive sectors also add quite a lot. And in terms of, well, there's a reality of, well, you can account for it. Then there's a question about, well, what is it you're doing with that? And what is it you're wanting to ask the bank for? And it's certainly true that in certain carbon intensive sectors like steel making, for example, there is a transition and there are investments being made to make zero carbon steel using either electric arc furnaces or hydrogen or whatever. But in things like expanding fossil fuel production and expanding infrastructure in fossil fuels, well, there's no way that money being channeled to that is going to do anything other than make the climate crisis worse. So right there, it's like that's where the red lines need to be drawn and where all of these trillions of dollars being kind of parked up, although the mental model it still comes from Hollywood and the movies, and like you want your money to be sitting there so you can use it. And you think, oh yeah, it's like in a bank and it's sitting there. Nothing is sitting there. It is flowing through the economy. There's decisions moving it through all the time. Your point on neobanks, there's some which are kind of maybe smaller in terms of payment provision, but there's quite a few new banks who are also doing primary lending too, just to different parts of the economy. And obviously there's specialist banks and green banks and community banks and all different flavors. There are thousands of banks in the world. And we're just sort of trying to hold up a mirror to some of these organizations, corporates, institutions, universities, where there's been a lot of momentum. I'd like to come back to that and say, you need to be using your influence here as much as you are in other parts of your supply chain, if not more so, because banking also has a massive influence on the shape of the transition. If finance and capital is going to things like expanding fossil fuels, then that infrastructure is going to be around for decades. So it's going to shape the future of our economy. If you choke off the debt towards those things and you redirect it towards green stuff, then the green stuff is going to become more familiar. It's going to become easier, cheaper, more demand, more supply, and we're going to move to the transition much quicker. So it's a big leverage point in being able to make the economy go in the right direction from a sustainability point of view.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that leverage point later. I'm just curious as to how you even go about calculating the emissions from cash. I worked on the trading desk when the Lehman bankruptcy happened. And I remember somebody coming in, I was working on the distress desk, and they put their 10K in front of me and they were like, figure out what the, recovery is. I have never been more scared of a task in my entire life. Looking through a bank, a big corporate like a JP Morgan's balance sheet and cash, and trying to understand where things are going and what they have on balance sheet versus off balance sheet is, I think, probably as an analyst, one of the most challenging sectors. So how did you guys go about doing this?
Yeah, and it's a topical issue in terms of what regulators are either forcing or not forcing banks to disclose. But quite simply put, so the 10K breaks out, what has a company got? Where is it sending the cash on its balance sheet? And you can then trace that through the system by taking banks who, through the Pillar 3 disclosures, which basically kind of says, these are the sectors which we're lending to. There was a collaborative project that many US banks are also part of called the Partnership for Carbon Accounting and Financials, PCAF, and they assigned emission factors to a sector. So it's a very broad brush averaging basis, but it's like energy, fossil fuels, roughly speaking, for every $1 billion, this is the tons of carbon which are associated. And so you're able to make this on an averaging basis across the banking sector as a whole. So we took a basket of banks. We didn't break down, well, who's banking with who and in what proportions. We've taken the large US banks. We've taken their regulatory disclosures, which break down all their lending across every sector. Then we've applied the emissions factors per sector to get a roughly right answer. And what's interesting at the moment in the climate disclosures debate is everyone's saying, well, this isn't quite accurate enough and we shouldn't be forced to divulge this information and everything. The reality is it doesn't actually take too long to be able to get an answer, a pointer, a feel for this number, which is roughly right, and that you can do something with, and you can contextualize it against, well, what's the rest of our emissions? And that's what we did with these companies, to sort of say, wow, this is actually as big as, or in some cases even bigger than everything else you are doing. A lot of these like lean software kind of companies who are mostly cloud-based, they've got relatively small emissions for the size of the company they are in turnover, but they're holding all this cash, which is doing things actively in the economy every day.
So your report suggests two things, really. First, that companies use the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials method, PCAF, to calculate their financial footprint. And then second is to engage with their financial partners. So what happens here? Like if you're an Atlassian or you're Patagonia, you go to JP Morgan and you say, hey, we know you're using our cash to finance the fossil fuel industry. You have to stop it. Otherwise, we'll pull our money out. I see a lot of challenges with that. One, if you're Apple, they're already struggling, Alphabet, Apple. They have too much cash on the balance sheet. They don't know what to do with it. They've been using it for stock buybacks. That's not enough. So they have some limitations there. And then two, how can you ever, I just finished watching that limited series on Madoff. How can you trust a bank to do what they say they're doing?
Yeah. So, one case and point which is topical right now is with universities in the UK. So led by Cambridge University, there was a study done and they looked at their financial supply chain and concluded that the bank they were with, which happened to be Barclays, was continuing to finance fossil fuels. That was, a matter that they could establish and validate. And they said, this is not compatible with what the IEA scenario said, with what the net zero high-level expert group that Antonio Guterres at the UN set out. And they said, it's just not good enough for us. So you either change that policy or we will look to retender our banking. And they're retendering their banking. And there's at least 20, probably maybe even 3 times that numbers of universities who are doing the same. So I think there is something now where you can sort of, and this is not with precedent that there's this action kind of taken, and it's not taken lightly. I think that if you are a company, yes, you need to get your handle around, well, what are the financed emissions? You're absolutely right. You need to be able to look at also the data sources in terms of the entire span of activities. So what's going off balance sheet, the facilitated transactions. That's also now covered in the PCAF methodologies. Again, it's possible. It's not easy to establish that. And organizations like Topo Finance is now helping organizations to do some of that accounting. It's like a forensic accounting exercise to get a handle on the problem. But then you need to develop the options. And the options are, you've either got to get your bank to change or you've got to change your bank. I mean, it's the same for corporate bond portfolios. I mean, you have to look at what the options are. There's ways potentially which you could design green financial products in order to be able to sort of satisfy this need. When looking around the market at the moment, a lot of green financial products have got the label, but it's just really difficult to see how, if at all, it's actually shifting anything towards being greener. It's putting a green label on things which are already green or would have been invested in anyway, and it's not really shifting the institutional balance. But just because they haven't done so in the past, it doesn't mean to say that we could design and construct things which actually really push financial institutions on a greener path through prosumer activity. So these companies saying, we want you to do these things, we want you to transition, and by buying into certain kind of strategies, we can make you do that. And ultimately, the threat has to be there. And if you don't, we need to be able to go somewhere else. And I think that it's a different landscape in different countries. But what's interesting with the neobanks is that they're technology companies with banking licenses, and they move very quickly. So cash management services have been highly profitable for banks, very sticky for banks, and entirely, as a consequence of both those factors, very disruptable. And some of these neobanks are coming in without legacy business, without profile in lending to fossil fuel. And I think that opens up a different landscape and a different sort of set of negotiation parameters for companies to have with their banks. And I suspect that things will change quite rapidly in the coming years.
Because when you think about these in universities, they have these massive endowments and they have a lot of cash, and they certainly have the leverage, but they don't have alternatives. So are you saying that they could then put their money into neobanks?
So in terms of alternatives, I think that there's an asymmetry in where the alternatives exist. I think that there are probably more alternatives in Europe, for example, compared perhaps to North America right now as a snapshot. But yes, neobanks, yes, new technology solutions, yes, the diversity of smaller regional community banks, green banks, alternative banks, and yes to new solutions, quite frankly, from some of the, funnily enough, big tech companies like the Microsofts, Googles, Apples of the world, who have already stepped into financial services. So they know that there's a business they want to be in. If the other financial services providers are not doing what it is they want and need, they have the capabilities to create them themselves as well. So I think there's a range of different solutions, and we're looking at the whole palette of what might be possible for organizations. And the more that organizations speak up and signal the demand, the more innovation there'll be. So there's that sort of flywheel of innovation, which will start as the consciousness increases.
But in your report, it looked like there have been examples of companies like Atlassian, like Patagonia, that have gone to their banks, and their banks have agreed to keep their cash away from funding fossil fuels. So is there precedent to companies actually just sticking with the same banks and the banks agreeing not to use that cash for things that the companies don't agree with?
I think it's still early days. So I think that there's been some of these first steps in being able to lean into this, into having the conversations. I don't think we're at a resting point at all. And I think that the means of being able to separate out different bits of balance sheets within a bank is highly problematic. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it is highly problematic. So we're going to be looking at, well, what might a green corporate deposit or a green cash management system with real integrity look like? How might that be designed? Typo Finance worked with the Exponential Roadmap Initiative on producing a greening cash action guide. But that's really kind of about getting the coordinates and starting those conversations. I think there's still more work to be done. And the ideal, and I think what we're beginning to see the signs of now, is that corporates are wanting to tackle this together. So if they're approaching their bank on a one-by-one basis, they might get something, they might not. But if they were to take it on a collective basis, given the trillions that they're representing and the collective voice that they're mobilizing elsewhere, that's the thing which is going to move markets very quickly. And they've already demonstrated that they can do that.
So is this the sort of thing that only works when you have a group of corporates banding together and saying, or unless you're Alphabet or Microsoft or, Apple, because then you have so much cash that you can get what you need out of a bank. But does it require a group of corporates to come together for this?
I think it works best when it's a movement, but it doesn't take many to be able to create that momentum. That's what Cambridge University over here in the UK have demonstrated. They've got a lot of followers. I know there's a lot of universities around the world, starting when the US universities with the size of their endowments get into this. I think that's going to have very powerful impact. And for sure, I think that as this builds into a movement and becomes recognized, it will be seen and responded to very differently by financial institutions.
I think for Cambridge, it started with the student body. Wasn't it that the students were protesting that the endowment's cash is going to fund fossil fuels, and therefore that's why the university took action?
There's been some student awareness and activism across lots of campuses in universities, which kind of creates the sort of the starting point to actually look at it. But it was, so I know Dr. Ellen Quigley, who led that research in Cambridge, did a fantastic piece, very deep research, looking at all of the issues, being able to kind of put something together, which wasn't just theoretical and academic, but actually was practical in terms of, well, what is it we can do about it? And I think they've been very thoughtful and considered in how they've stepped forward. And as a result, that's given other institutions the means to follow on that path. And I think that's a really interesting model for other progressive corporates and others wanting to kind of take this forward in their own regions.
And how do you prevent, because banks are masters at financial engineering, right? So you can issue a loan and then you could have some sort of credit risk transfer with another party like a hedge fund and move it off balance sheet. So how would you prevent banks from agreeing to do this and then just putting it in a place where nobody could see it?
Yeah, I mean, you are absolutely right. The financial system is complex. It's not an anomaly. It's kind of a design feature. So you have to be constantly scrutinizing. You have to constantly parse the policies to be able to understand what is it referring to. Is that exclusion got an actual exemption to it? Being able to forensically look through. And yet what I'd say is that there is in supply chain sustainability and value chain sustainability a lot of competency in being able to look through supply chains. I mean, there's in textile, in manufacturing, in electronics, in all sorts of manufacturing, there's these kind of complexity. You have to constantly be scrutinizing. You have to constantly be doing due diligence, which drills down deeper. But there are these practices, there are these competencies in management teams. It's just a question of attention. And frankly, it's a means of being able to train banks. So until someone is looking at it, they kind of feel like, well, no one's really looking. So some of these green products which come out can be pretty flaky because there isn't the degree of scrutiny. And it's very different to have some of the scrutiny coming only from NGO actors, because it's kind of expected. Well, of course, the NGOs aren't going to be happy. They might be dismissed. But if you've got like 7 trillion of capital from the non-financial institutions just in the US alone, saying this isn't good enough. And if you don't do something, then we're going to do something. That's a completely different commercial decision-making process. And I think it'll lead to very different outcomes.
So what we're talking about really is a movement. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it is. I think we've got this. It's the seeds of a movement are already starting. As I said, Typo Finance and others in this space were connecting with corporates, large and small, with different types of institution, with different bits of the movement, all approaching it, slightly different angles, slightly different service requirements, big variation, as I mentioned, across different countries and regions, but a common aim to sort of say, yes, the financial supply chain is part of our overall value chain. Yes, actually, it can have a dramatic impact in terms of the direction of the transition, which we care about. And yes, we've got a lot more agency in being able to influence this direction if we figure out how to use it and start applying that pressure in a thoughtful, considered, and consistent way.
So how do you see this sort of social movement coming about? Do you see it as corporates have to lead the way? Do you see it as with Cambridge University, where the students are the ones that kind of rise up and say, look, we're not going to participate in this. The university has to do something. You know, when I think about like small businesses, for example, a lot of them really care about where their cash goes, but they don't have options. It is so hard I work in the startup world. It's so hard for a startup to open a bank account. And so they go with wherever they can. They don't like it, but they go with wherever they can. So is that a case of them having to wait for the large corporates to take a position and then for them to follow along? How do you see this sort of forming?
Yeah, I think that real action, real movement starts when you get these large anchor institutions being able to take on the subject in a very consequential commercial way. Like, you do this or we go there. And that gets a response. It's sometimes a response which is, the influence isn't just about the amount of cash. It can also be the reputational connotation of what it means. I mean, Cambridge University and some of these universities are fairly large as institutions, but they're not the size of Apple. But what they mean in society and how they can kind of galvanize others is very important. I think banks are aware of that. So some of the things which students and other stakeholders can do are great in terms of creating the conditions, but the rubber hits the road when somebody actually takes it on, and it then becomes a commercial conversation with consequences. And I think you're right that people's agency in the system varies widely. And I think that's why it's incumbent upon those who are most able to, and are demonstrating in lots of other ways. Let's be clear. I mean, Apple and these companies that speak to about their sustainability sort of strategies, and it's pretty well evolved. They need to be also modeling how they can take it to this with the same degree of scrutiny. I mean, you may have seen Apple's advert with Mother Nature, and they're talking about all the different things that they're doing. They didn't talk about the 200 billion of cash. It's like that, but that's not a rounding error. I mean, that is a colossal sum of money. It's more money than probably all the startups in the US. So, you can't sort of be selective. And I think that companies are getting their heads around this, and they're figuring out how to make it into a consequential next step.
Is it your understanding that some of these organizations like the Apple and Microsofts of the world genuinely don't know about this? Or do you think that there are people in the organization that do know about it and just don't want to touch it because they don't even know how to approach it?
So 2 years ago, we went around and we spoke to these people, and I can hand on heart say they genuinely did not know. And now this follow-up report, the Carbon Bank Roll 2 is out, and it's all about being able to shift this awareness into action. I can hand on heart say they know now. They're not necessarily fully clear on what to do about it. And there's a sort of a circularity in terms of, well, we're not sure if the options are ready yet. And it's just like, yeah, but you need to basically clearly signal the demand for those options to be there, and what is it you're going to be doing if they're not there in order for those options to be generated. And I think that's where you're seeing some being able to step in, hopefully many more, and then this beginning to kind of build as a movement. It doesn't need everybody to join up. Once the options are there and you've got a differentiated landscape and you see money shifting around and people making the choices, banks will need to respond. It will go straight into strategy. I was a strategy director. You're seeing customers move out, and big customers and high reputation customers. That's a trigger far more than angry students. That plays a role. But this is something which would be escalated from a strategic management perspective right to the top.
You had this great post on LinkedIn recently about JP Morgan and their emissions footprint. I don't know if that was recent. I went onto your LinkedIn and I looked at the posts because I wanted to read through all your blog posts.
Some time ago, it's still relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. They talked about their emissions. They have a group dedicated to purchasing removals. So initially, they started off with offsets. There's obviously a reputational issue with offsets. They've moved now into very expensive removals. And we'll get to that a little bit later because I want your take on that. But then you calculated what their actual emissions footprint is, which is, multiples of what they're saying it is right now. So it actually, it doesn't make sense for them to do anything but restrict the capital to fossil fuel companies, right? Is there another approach that banks can take where they still, like, let's just say, okay, when you think about like exploration production companies or energy traders, all of them have this massive credit facility. They usually have a revolver. If they didn't have those loans from banks, they could not operate. They would shut down. Is there a way, because banks are stakeholders to those companies, is there a way for them to go to those companies and say, this can't be a hedge. Like, this needs to be a strategic priority. We will provide funding to you, but we need real evidence that you're transitioning over and you have some sort of path to move away from fossil fuels and towards something greener.
Yeah, and that is starting to happen. It's only a few cases, but if you take, Danske Bank, it's a large European bank, and they have now said that they will not renew their revolving credit facilities to energy companies and fuel businesses if they're expanding fossil fuels. So they're not cutting them off because they've still got some legacy business. It's not the turning the tap off narrative, which is misused so often, but it's saying, if you are literally adding to the stock of the problem that's getting worse, you cannot be on a credible transition pathway. So we will not renew your credit facility. And I think that that's part one of what is probably a more integrated sort of approach, as you sort of articulated, which is, well, it can't be any expansion, and the phase down and the transition shift to clean renewable energy needs to be commensurate with the climate goals of 1.5 degrees. So there are some banks starting to do that. What you still have are banks who are selectively taking certain things out. So the emissions that you mentioned about the removals in JP Morgan, that was looking at just their scope 1 and 2. So like what their offices and the electricity sort of they consume, which is, it's not nothing, but according to, I think, Carbon Disclosure Project said that it was about 1/700th of the total emissions relating to a bank, because most of it's through what they finance. And I did that scratch calculation. If they would apply removal offset credits to their entire portfolio, JP Morgan would be insolvent tomorrow. So it isn't going to make that calculation. And in fact, there's way too much attention being paid on creating these synthetic measures which flatter what a bank looks like, as opposed to making these difficult decisions, which Danske Bank and I think other banks will be making, to sort of say, no, we actually have to have some consequences here. And what they will be doing in their strategy conversations is relying upon the fact that there's just way more opportunity now in the green transition. So make those policy changes, go fully into green, there's more than enough to invest in. So it's being able to kind of make that unequivocal sort of shift to green rather than, I mean, every bank is still financing renewable energy. I mean, they're doing the green stuff. It's just that they're doing the stuff which undermines at the same time. And that doesn't work when it comes to, managing carbon budgets.
So Larry Fink's latest investor letter, which was really a huge disappointment, he's scaling back massively. He's calling it energy pragmatism, being pragmatic rather than dogmatic in the energy transition. And it's not just him, but I just attended the Economist Sustainability Conference Week, and it's almost mostly entirely attended by corporates. And across the board, you're seeing everyone, scale back and step back from their science-based targets. So this is a tough economic environment. How do we move forward despite the fact that companies are more focused on saving costs rather than, reaching their net zero targets?
Yeah, I mean, it's really the opposite of pragmatism. I mean, it's a dogmatic view that I should just be able to keep making profits despite the fact that science tells us more than clearly that there's no way that the future can continue in the way that the past has. And there's a sort of a complete denial underpinning what was in Larry Fink's letter. I think that before, when people were kind of lifting him up as this sort of guru for pro-sustainability, he was sort of saying, hey, we can make money over here in sustainability. Now he's sort of saying, oh, hang on a second, we don't want to stop the music on taking the profits here.
We have to make money.
But the Earth systems, and we live on a living planet for the time being, those living systems and the planetary boundaries, these are real physical limits. They are biological kind of tipping points. And if we tip beyond the points where humanity can live, and we're talking about parts of the globe which will be uninhabitable within decades, then there's not really any, it's not about pragmatism to sort of say we can keep taking profits when that's happening, because it's going to have such disruption. And I think that there's still this overriding competitive element of, we want to be doing better than the other fund managers within this quarter, and let us do that, despite the fact that the vehicle that then they're all collectively in is driving us over the cliff edge. And that's where I think what's really being signaled by not just Larry Fink, because I don't think they're the worst by a long way, but I think collectively across the financial sector, this is where what's being demonstrated in the voluntary initiatives is that voluntary initiatives may have been quite useful in being able to make sense of things and share some knowledge, but at a certain moment, you absolutely need mandated regulatory action to say this is no longer possible, and we have to cut you off now, and the decision isn't yours, because otherwise, what I think that Larry Fink's letter really says is we are just too enmeshed and entangled in this system to know how to stop and to start doing anything differently. So if we're going to wait for that and that kind of leadership, I think we'd be waiting too long. When you do see leaders, I mentioned Danske Bank, there's other financial institutions around the world, there's ones who've been pioneering green banks and doing some fantastic stuff for decades. But to be able to level up, you need the regulators, you need the central banks, you need governments to say, enough is enough. We've seen that these ones can do it, so you can all do it now. That's the only way that it really happens.
Imagine the impact of some government coming out and telling corporates, it is now mandatory for you to include your financial supply chain into your Scope 3 calculations. Like the financial impact of that immediately overnight, that would be absolutely a game changer. It would be accelerating everything.
Yeah, I mean, this is in debate now, in certainly amongst the kind of the key standards. So in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which has gone to review, this came up in the consultation. People are looking at it. It's starting to become much more widely. There's a wider awareness. I think that it's still some time for governance to be able to legislate, but it's not just about legislation for disclosure. Ultimately, the governments need to be figuring out what the consequences are, because at the moment you can get people to disclose absolutely everything, but if there's no consequences, then that's not going to be sufficient to drive behavior change. So really what I think governments need to be thinking about is not just the what, but the so what. And they need to figure out what are the consequences, what are the limits that they can tolerate. And if people are going beyond, if they're not on pathways for climate transition, and I'd include some of the targets on biodiversity within that, then well, that's where the government needs to act if it's going to protect societies in the future, which is kind of a prime responsibility, no matter which party you represent.
So going back to the removals side of things, or the voluntary markets that you just mentioned, like we discussed, banks are now investing heavily into carbon capture. Particularly, there's a lot of money going into direct air capture, which is still a very nascent space and doesn't move the needle at all as it stands right now. What are your thoughts on this? How viable is it from a long-term perspective?
Yeah, so there's multiple objections. So yes, it's small. I think it will get a lot bigger. I think that there is definitely an element of distraction because it's being kind of touted as a solution whilst we're still increasing the infrastructure which is causing the problem. And there's a lot of questions about, well, does it really work? And what about the cost? Which I think are well-founded. A lot of times, though, in technology, things can improve. I think the biggest issue is the moral hazard of the fact that if you actually follow the supply chains of where carbon capture storage, CCUS, DAC, everything is being put into operation, it's mostly through the same companies and the same investors who are plowing funds into pollution. And the moral hazard of sort of saying, well, you're creating pollution and then you're charging people to clean it up. And some NGOs, I think, have sort of said, well, this isn't logical. Why would you put your eggs in the basket of direct air carbon capture and storage? Why not just stop the problem at source? And the key insight is because the promoters are getting paid at both ends. And the more pollution they're creating, the higher the carbon price, because the carbon pollution will be high, and therefore the more they might well get paid to clean up that pollution. And that is a moral hazard, design of markets, regulatory question, which unless governments get ahead of, whilst the amount of this is still relatively small, then I think it could become a massive issue for exacerbating inequalities and unfairness in the world. It's being driven by a powerful narrative, and that powerful narrative is, well, we're going to need capture. And that is true, and it's becoming more true because the narrative is being driven by those who literally are the ones creating the problem that is making it necessary in the first place. And right there, you have got the makings of, that's the kind of the sort of the disaster movie sort of introduction that sets the scene for people, the next generation down the line who are going to have to unpick this, looking back and going, what on earth were they thinking designing in this way? And often it's just a deficit of attention. I mean, when you really look into it, most people can see this, but these narratives are powerful, the stakeholders are powerful, and it's becoming more true the more that we follow that path.
So staying on this theme of technology, I listened to one of your podcasts recently, and you talked about how there's so much of the transition that doesn't require high tech. So I would love to hear you elaborate on that a little bit. And then also, if you have any thoughts on where technology can accelerate the process of corporates transforming their financial supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, if you take, for example, agriculture, for sure, there's lots of really interesting new tech around that and measurement devices and all sorts of kind of new interventions. But At its core, the transition in agriculture could be quite simple. It's about being able to wean us off the sort of the inverted commas technologies introduced in the sort of the what was called the Green Revolution, which was mostly around kind of artificial fertilizers and pesticides and other things, which has depleted the soil of its carbon, of all the nutrients, of its capacity to be able to store and retain water, and has made it dependent upon byproducts of a fossil fuel industry. And we're somehow now locked into that because the nutrients have gone, the soil carbon has gone, the water retention has gone. But being able to regenerate soil, which can actually be done by quite low-tech natural methods in terms of the types of plants which are in the ground, the ways in which animals on farms are used, being able to drive root systems, getting all the fungal mycorrhizal layers to kind of sustain the microbial life. It's like that's something which means that you don't just get carbon sequestration, so it's a plus for the climate. You're weaning yourself off all of the artificial, mostly nitrogen-based fertilizers, which again are byproducts of a fossil fuel and carbon pollution industry. But you're also getting resilience because you've got management of vital resources like water through the deep root systems, which allow for crops to be more tolerant in floods and in droughts. So you're getting these multiple benefits, and it doesn't require massive unproven tech. It's being done, and it has been successfully done, and it can be encouraged. And I think that what's been interesting in quite a few of the transitions that have taken place is that people said, yeah, but it's not as profitable as the old way, until there's a shock. So all the regenerative farmers were seen as being a little bit hippie and, this is quite elitist, until in Ukraine, with Russia's invasion, the prices of inputs for agriculture, so for fertilizer, massively went up, like manyfold. And suddenly regenerative agriculture, not so expensive. Likewise, in some of the transitions that we've seen in using now what is quite mature renewable energy technology. So Uruguay went through a very dramatic shift in its energy sources. So it went from virtually nothing to 98% renewable energy, mostly wind energy, in a relatively short space of time. At first, people said, we should have waited, and now our energy is too expensive. Again, because of global conflicts, now everyone else who's been completely dependent upon gas has seen supply disruption, has seen the prices spike, and suddenly Uruguay, as it turns out, made a really smart decision. So there's a lot of the components which we can do in the transition which don't rely upon new tech, but new tech will arrive. New tech will disrupt the ways in which we do things. We've seen, I'm an investor and advisor in companies who are doing some amazing things, making zero carbon concrete with bacteria as the binding agent, using AI to predict material properties and being able to create things which might make super efficient batteries. All sorts of things which are going to come in and might well disrupt what is taken as the received wisdom of what transition looks like. So transition pathways are just a story which might change tomorrow. And that's part of how not just banks, but every business, every economic actor has to constantly be aware of what is happening, what are the alternatives, what might be coming through, and making these decisions on a dynamic basis.
I had Dr. John Foley on the podcast, who's the executive director of Project Drawdown, and we talked about ag for a while because if all in, it contributes to like a third of emissions, but the solutions are really in things like reducing food waste, reducing meat consumption. Those things don't require tech. So Yeah, I think
There's a
it's a
lot of
really interesting one.
behavioral intervention, and being able to develop those new behaviors and normalize them also means extending your awareness that things like banking is also a behavior. It's a choice. It's something you have influence on. The fact that it hasn't been practiced means that it's a very unfamiliar behavior, and it will feel, no doubt, a little bit clunky at first. But as it becomes more practiced, as you see now with food waste, people get quite emotional about like having to have different recycling containers. But then it really takes not much time for everyone to go, oh yeah, this is just how it works now. And then you just get on and do it. And I think that there's a lot of fantastic interventions from the behavioral scientists in being able to speed up those transitions alongside technology, alongside some of the kind of the more political and regulatory kind of influences of change.
What about tech as it relates to fintech or creating more models for challenger banks? Is there a role for tech to play there?
Absolutely. And Climate Safe Lending Network, last year, just at COP, we launched the Climate Finance Catalyst Contest, which was an open call for innovation. So it was looking for entrepreneurs from within banks, within fintech, within anyone could enter. And there was an amazing array of innovative ideas, often being able to think about, well, what's the best way to be able to get to the end purpose, and what is it that banks do that some kind of maybe repackaging or small change could have a big difference. And we were overwhelmed by the range, the depth, quality of the entrants. We just had the awards in that. And I think that there's so much which can be done. I think that what bankers and people in financial institutions can often forget is that they do so much more than just provide the money. For sure, they do provide the capital, and that's really important. But they are, in the lives of their clients and in society, so much more than that in terms of being able to aggregate and make sense of data, in order to be able to benchmark performance, to be able to make connections to different suppliers who could help with the transition, to be able to structure products and drive incentive through every single transaction. There's all of these things which are constantly shaping the market in every transaction, in every interaction with a financial institution. And it's by being able to be aware of that you can actually extend the field and scope of innovation, and therefore your ability to steer the transition.
Thank you, James. The great thing about this podcast is finding organizations like Climate Safe Lending Network and finding extraordinary people like you that have dedicated your careers to this kind of work. So thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. As I said, yeah, some great questions. I enjoyed it.
And that is it for this episode with James Vaccaro. If you found it useful, please subscribe and write a positive review because it helps people discover the podcast. Thanks for listening, and catch you at the next one. Bye, everyone.